So what sort of hobby projects is it worth dedicating your time and money to in the run-up to 9th edition? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop, even as we transition from the known world of 8th to the brave new world of 9th edition. In this video, I'll talk about the hobby projects and purchases that I think might be a bit more tactical when we're faced with a new edition with significant unknowns, and some of the things that I think we should maybe avoid, at least for the time being, until 9th edition comes out. Now, I think it's a bit of a curious phenomena when a new edition is announced. People get very excited for the hobby in general. There's going to be new exciting changes, a bunch of problematic bugs fixed, and just generally a decent amount of upheaval, which might leave us with new and exciting options for our current miniatures on the tabletop. We already know that quite a lot of rules are changing, and we can make a few educated guesses about what sort of things might be stronger in the new edition, but in reality we can't really say anything for absolute certainty without the full picture. If nothing else, Games Workshop have said that they'll be looking at the points costs for everything, and if they wind up making some drastic changes, then the units that are best in 40k could absolutely turn on their head overnight. As hobbyists, and for myself in particular, I find that this gives a lot more hobby energy that I want to dedicate into painting some more miniatures up, but it's maybe not quite as obvious exactly what sort of miniatures we should be working on at the moment, as I suspect that the list that people might be building towards will at least change slightly with the dawn of 9th edition. Firstly, I thought it made sense to talk about a few of the things that I think aren't particularly worth working on or buying at the moment from Games Workshop. Basically, if you are thinking of buying anything that's absolutely enormous in 40k and the rules are a significant factor to you, then it's well worth holding off until after 9th edition comes out. If you're trying to build some sort of competitive army and are thinking about dropping a lot of money on a new army for plenty of units that have decent effect in game, I think it's worth re-evaluating when 9th is out before making that purchase. If you're not overly attached to the model's lore or the way that they look, then you really could be quite disappointed if you wind up with a lot of units that just don't work very well in game. I know that's certainly not the case for everyone. Looks and lore and background are really quite important to most people when selecting an army, but still it can be a bit of a turn-off if your absolutely beautiful painted faction of miniatures with fluff that you like have absolutely terrible rules in game. It can just mean that you don't get quite as many games in, as you just might not want to play with them quite as much if they're just getting steamrolled every time that you have a game with them. So unless you're pretty much certain that you'll be happy with the army regardless of how well it performs in game, then I'd hold off on major purchases until 9th. Similarly, if you are buying some sort of big model kit and there's a major decision to be made as to how it assembles, then you should probably try and limit making really big war gear choices until 9th edition drops. Say if you've bought a Tower Riptide already and you're not sure whether you want to arm it with an ion accelerator or a heavy burst cannon, and you're not wanting to magnetize it, then it might be worth just blue tacking it in place or doing some sort of other temporary fixing until the edition comes out, and then you can make your choice if you do want to glue the chosen item in place. The same goes for a common type of gun across an entire army. Say if you were playing Necrons and you wanted your Immortals to either all have Gauss or all have Tesla, that might well be a decision to hold off until we have the new information, as you could be committing to arming a whole ton of models with the same guns, and then within a couple of months' time, in retrospect, you might have made a decision that you regret. If you can magnetize though, or it's the sort of kit that can swap options in and out, then that's pretty ideal. I'd also think about limiting things like specialist unit choices, things that are really quite niche within a codex and only really work with certain builds. In general, I tend to find that the core HQ and troops choices for an army can at least fairly reliably attract attention if they aren't very well balanced throughout most of an edition, but that's less so of more specialist units. Say for example Space Marine Landspeeders throughout 8th, they're not exactly a core choice, they have gone down in points a little bit since they came out, but they've still been a bad choice all edition. I think at least partly because they're just not one of the most core units, so I don't think Games Workshop will receive quite as many complaints if they haven't made them really competitive. Compare that to say Primaris Intercessors, who started out pretty bad in terms of points for the amount of damage you got out of them, and are now one of the stronger units in the game. Finally, I'd strongly think about avoiding things like codexes for Necrons or Space Marines, both of which we'll know will be featured in the starter box, and if it follows anything like the previous edition, then it means that we could well see codex for them very early in the cycle. Necrons is pretty much guaranteed, seeing as we've already seen the codex cover art, and because they're getting quite so big a unit update, I'd strongly suspect to see a codex from them very early. I'm a little bit less certain about Space Marines. They are receiving a ton of new units, which could certainly warrant a codex drop, but they did have theirs redone around about a year ago now, so it is a fairly recent release. Either way, I wouldn't buy either of these books at present, and I'd also be a bit wary of the other books that came out fairly early in the codex release cycle, things like Grey Knights, Astra Militarum, Craftworld Eldar and Death Guard. as they've gone for quite a while without a new codex, so it might mean that they get their updates sooner. Obviously it goes without saying that the 8th rulebook is not a good purchase right now, as it's going to be out of date within a couple of months. Talking of 8th rulebooks going away, the Dark Imperium box will be going soon, so if you really want the Death Guard or Primaris contents from this box, it could well be worth picking up. I'm not going to lie, it is worse value than it was before, due to that 8th rulebook not being worth much anymore. But even despite that, it's still one of the best value boxes that Games Workshop produces, as you get an absolute ton of miniatures with fairly recent sculpts in it, and it's basically 2 extremely good start collecting boxes rolled into one. I strongly suspect that after this goes away, things like Gravis Captains and Primaris Ancients are going to be costing you more if you want to add them to your army. The same being said for some of the Death Guard characters, and we're really not sure if things like Poxwalkers will receive their own release, or whether you might be trapped in the same sort of situation as Chaos Cultists with just a few very limited sculpts from an easy build kit. Whether you're actually buying this entire box now, or if you just want one of the individual miniatures, it might well be worth looking at eBay, as they're probably only going to get more expensive in price. Just before a new edition drops is a bit of a dubious time to be starting a new army, but honestly I strongly suspect that a lot of people do this. Basically you just get a bit of hype for something, a good new project for a brave new world, and often you certainly can start getting some units together for an army that will be functioning in an edition, even if you don't know exactly what that edition will bring. I not tend to go absolutely crazy adding new units to the army, but there's no reason that you can't build up a small patrol type force. So at least you've got your colour scheme down and a fair few core units that you can build around going forward. I'd honestly start with pretty much the most generic and basic units in the army, things that you're almost guaranteed to want in the new edition. If you're Space Marines, then Primaris Intercessors aren't a bad shout at all. They are going to be a core troops choice going forward. For Adeptus Mechanicus, Rangers or Vanguard, or HQs like the Tech Priest Dominus are likely to be fairly central to the army. For Orcs, you can rarely go wrong with a bunch of boys, Gretchen and a War Boss. Plenty of armies just have units that are going to be pretty much integral to the way that an army functions, no matter what edition it's in, so I'd start with these sort of purchases. If you are buying anything that has multiple options, and if you can use magnetization or just slotting things in and out to maximise the flexibility of the units, then that's a really good idea. And if you do have a unit that, like a tank that can change its guns around, then it can both give you a lot more adaptability and resilience to changing rules, but you can just also swap it out for fun game on game and give you a little bit of a different playing experience. We can think about predicting some early rules leaks, but you should really take these with a lot of caution, because without knowing the whole picture, they might not necessarily mean much. For example, in 9th we know that tanks are going to be a bit more immune to being tagged in close combat by a lone infantry person, which I'll admit is a really significant advantage compared with where they are now, and it's easy to assume that, say, tanks will be absolutely OP in 9th edition, we should be all getting some of them. However, with points cost changing and not knowing the other rules that might be changing as well, this could massively trip us up, because if every tank in the game goes up by 20% in points cost to compensate for this, then it might not be any better news for them at all. I'd say a similar thing with blast weapons. In general it looks like they are going to be getting better, but they might rise in points cost to compensate. It does look like anything that's relying on multiple -1s to hit though is likely going to be less powerful, so if you are using 3 or 4 different rules to put -4 to hit on a particular unit, and that's the only way that you can reasonably field it, I would say that that's probably a fairly safe bet that it's not going to be as good in the future. I'd look out for units that might become defunct in the future. For Necrons this is going to be fairly obvious. Basically anything with those green glowing Gauss rods, things like the Monolith, Necron Warriors or Destroyers are all going to be gone soon, so if you're adding those sort of units to your army, you might not be able to get any more in the future, and you might have a bit of a mishmash look. I'd also be a little bit more wary of things like older style Space Marines, particularly fine cast characters and things, which could at some point be trimmed from the range, much like Games Workshop trimmed much of Warhammer Fantasy's older models. Games Workshop have confirmed that older style non-Primaris Space Marines aren't going anywhere at the moment, so I suspect that you're good for 9th on those fronts, but that might not necessarily carry over to the next edition. We'll have to wait and see. Regardless, when you are making purchases, I'd make sure you save all the bits and spares, just in case you might want to refit some of the models at a later date, if some rules for, say, a specific special weapon become extra tasty. If you're not looking to start a new army and you're just adding to an existing one, or going on with other projects, there's plenty of other things that you can be doing. I know that most of us have had a fair bit of time off with the lockdown to finish up existing projects, but I'm sure that many people, including myself, have plenty more that they could be going at. It can be really quite rewarding to harness a bit of that excess energy that you get from being motivated for a new edition, and put that into getting some of the projects on your back burner done, so you've got a nice shiny contingent of new models to field and see how they react with the new rules. If you've already got them, then you're not really wasting any more money. If you are looking to add new units or characters, then again I'd say similar things to the starting a new army. Some core troops, flexible units and HQs are some of the best things, or painting up some additional special weapon options for squads or characters. Back at the end of 7th edition, I took some time to flesh out my Space Marines a little bit. I mainly had a lot of ground-based Assault Marine type troops, so I finally took some time to paint up some actual tactical Marines with bolters, and magnetised a few special weapon Marines so they could have melter, plasma or flamer. Even though I had no idea what the rules would be, I've got a lot of use out of those models over this edition, as they're just quite universal so can easily be plugged in and played in a lot of lists. A few other decent options could be some fun allies for your army, pretty general purpose things such as adding an assassin or two in, or maybe things like inquisitors which can usually ally in fairly freely. They can just give your army a bit of a different extra dimension that you can bring along for some fun games, and who knows, sometimes they might be competitive. I took the end of 7th as an opportunity to try and kit bash myself one of each of the 4 assassins. I'll admit that some of them turned out a little bit better than others, but regardless there have also been miniatures that I've used quite a lot over the course of 8th. Diversifying from actual miniatures, you could also focus on other hobby projects. In particular, getting some terrain painted up could be a pretty reasonable use of time, as it's often the sort of thing that gets left behind a bit in lieu of painting up more cool miniatures. As we don't know what sort of rules the miniatures are going to have, it might make sense to make some more gains in that sort of area, and then focus on miniatures again back when we know what rules are coming. You could also look at other storage solutions for miniatures, maybe make something a bit more permanent or hard wearing for them. And for purchases, you could also think about other painting equipment, maybe trying to get some airbrushed skills on the go, or try out some other hobby tools and things, rather than spending extra money on miniatures that might not see much play if the rules change drastically. Bear in mind that even when 9th comes out, it will be a living rule set. I'm sure that they'll be adjusting things with chapter approved and the various codexes that come out, and in a way I think that this relieves some of the pressure off a bit. The projects that you take on and the things that you purchase are never likely to be 100% optimal forever, and who knows, some of the less optimal things that you painted up might well just get solid buffs and be very strong later in the edition. This definitely adds to my feeling of yes, maybe just paint what you like and don't stress too much about the rules, things tend to cycle around. If you've got any other thoughts or ideas yourself on this topic, please let me know down in the description below. What are you working on at the moment, and is the hype around 9th edition making you any more or less excited to paint up minis? If you've enjoyed the discussion, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics for more. We have regular 40k tactics content coming out pretty much every day. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, I'd just like to mention my Element Games affiliate link, which is down in the video description below. Basically, if you live in the UK, Element Games does a certain percentage of Warhammer 40k items, so if you were thinking about buying any Warhammer in the near future, then if you click on the link in the description and order through them, then a small amount of money goes to help support Auspex Tactics without costing you any more at all. So it can just be a little bit of an easy way to support the channel if you were thinking about buying some miniatures anyway. I have a similar link for Amazon in the USA and Canada. Again, they stock pretty much all 40k products, so if you click on them and order through there, support Auspex Tactics, and it doesn't cost you any more at checkouts. A big thank you to those of you who have been doing this. It really does help justify the time spent on making the videos for this channel. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.